From 1947, with a short break, Mikhail Suslov held the post of Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, CPSU, for ideology. It was not just a position. It was the post of High Priest, keeper of the sacred texts of Marxism-Leninism. He was in charge of everything that shaped the minds of millions of Soviet citizens: propaganda, culture, science, education. From newspaper headlines to theater productions, from school textbooks to scientific dissertations, nothing could see the light of day without his tacit approval. Suslov determined what was the correct way of thinking and what was heresy. He established invisible but solid boundaries of what was permissible. A step to the left or right of the party's general line, which he himself had drawn, was considered not a mistake, but treason. For many party officials and representatives of the creative intelligentsia, this meant constantly walking on a knife's edge. One careless word, one overly bold metaphor in a novel, one incorrect interpretation of a historical event, and the machinery of repression was set in motion. Suslov personally reviewed the minutes, read the memos, and delved into the details. His memory was phenomenal, and his meticulousness legendary. He could recall a phrase uttered by an official 10 years earlier and use it as evidence of his ideological instability. The consequences could vary, from a reprimand and dismissal to complete oblivion and expulsion from the party, which in those days was tantamount to civil death. Suslov's harshness was not ostentatious. It was methodical and cold. Like a surgeon's scalpel, he did not seek personal gain or luxury. He sincerely believed that he was protecting the purity of the doctrine, and in this belief he was ruthless. His name is inextricably linked with the most high-profile ideological campaigns of the post-war period. In the late 1940s, he was one of the main organizers of the fight against so-called cosmopolitanism. This campaign, directed against the intelligentsia, primarily Jewish, led to the dismissal, arrest, and persecution of thousands of talented scientists, writers, and doctors. Suslov personally oversaw the purges in the apparatus, ruthlessly getting rid of those who, in his opinion, were not sufficiently loyal to the Soviet system. His role was particularly evident in the 1960s and 1970s, during the era of the fight against dissidents. He was the chief architect of the trial of writers Andrei Sinyavsky and Yuli Daniel in 1965. They were tried not for anti-Soviet activities in the usual sense, but for literary works published in the West under pseudonyms. Suslov insisted on a show trial, which was to serve as a lesson to the entire intelligentsia. Dissent in any form would be punished to the full extent of the law. The fear of Suslov was entirely rational. He was not a tyrant or a despot. He was the system. A system that worked flawlessly, methodically grinding down anyone who dared to think differently. And although he seemed to be only the second man in the party, his ideological power made him almost more dangerous than the General Secretary himself. After all, General Secretaries came and went, but Suslov, the guardian of ideology, remained. Suslov's unsinkability, his ability to outlive Stalin, outmaneuver Khrushchev, and become indispensable to Brezhnev, gave his colleagues in the Politburo a deep, almost mystical sense of unease. They saw him not just as a functionary, but as the living embodiment of the party apparatus, faceless, omniscient, and devoid of emotion. His true power was fully revealed in October 1964. The removal of Nikita Khrushchev was not just a palace coup, but a carefully staged spectacle. And it was Suslov who was the chief director and scriptwriter. At the very same meeting of the Presidium of the Central Committee, where Khrushchev's fate was being decided, Suslov took on the role of chief prosecutor. But it was not an emotional speech, nor was it a settling of personal scores. It was a dry, methodical, and deadly accurate report in which he listed, point by point, not the political failures, but the ideological sins of the first secretary. He spoke of voluntarism, subjectivism, violation of Leninist norms of party life, and underestimation of the role of the party. To the ears of a party apparatchik, these phrases sounded more frightening than accusations of failure in agriculture or the Caribbean crisis. Suslov struck at the very heart of the system, its dogmas. He did not overthrow a man. He passed an ideological sentence that could not be appealed. The members of the Presidium of the Central Committee who were present at the meeting, many of whom had sworn allegiance to Khrushchev only yesterday, sat in silence, realizing that they were facing not just a conspirator, but a supreme judge whose decision was final. This episode forever cemented Suslov's reputation as a man capable of making and removing anyone, even the top man. The source of his enormous influence was his access to information. His office, or more precisely, his head, contained the most complete and detailed archive of compromising information on the entire Soviet elite. As the chief ideologist, he not only controlled the press, but also received reports from the KGB on the mood among the intelligentsia and party circles. He received denunciations, memos, and reports on trips abroad, where every careless word and every inappropriate contact was recorded. He knew which members of the Politburo secretly admired Western art, whose children behaved inappropriately, and who allowed themselves to make critical remarks in private circles. He did not use this information for petty blackmail. He simply kept it, and everyone knew that he kept it. This created an aura of omniscience around him. A conversation with Suslov was like a confession, with the only difference being that there was no absolution. On the contrary, every sin was recorded in an invisible file, to be brought to light at the right moment. This fear was reinforced by his unique personal style. At a time when the party nomenclature was increasingly immersed in bourgeois comforts, special allowances, special rations, imported cars, Suslov demonstratively adhered to asceticism. For decades he wore the same style of suit, wore out old coats, and his ever-present rubber galoshes in bad weather became a byword in the Kremlin. There is a story about how, during an illness, he refused the imported medicines offered to him by Kremlin doctors, demanding to be treated exclusively with Soviet drugs. "Treat me with what you treat our people," he allegedly said. This was not posturing. It was his way of elevating himself above the rest. Having no material weaknesses, he had the moral right to judge those who were susceptible to them. He could not be bribed or tempted by privileges. His only passion was the purity of ideology, and he was fanatical in his service to it. Against the backdrop of other members of the Politburo, who did not shy away from taking advantage of their position, Suslov looked like a stern Puritan, which made his accusations even more weighty and frightening. His influence was not limited to the borders of the Soviet Union. He was the Grand Inquisitor of the entire socialist camp. When deviations or attempts at liberalization arose in fraternal communist parties, it was Suslov who went there to inspect. His visit to any of the countries of Eastern Europe caused panic among the local party leadership. He met with leaders, conducted long, exhausting conversations, testing them for ideological steadfastness. His reports to Moscow decided the fate of entire states. This was the case in 1968 in Czechoslovakia. He was one of the first to see Alexander Dubček's socialism with a human face as a mortal threat to the entire system, and became the main proponent of military intervention. His argument was simple and ironclad. Any concession, any liberalization was a crack in the monolith that would inevitably lead to its collapse. He was the guardian not only of Soviet, but also of global communist orthodoxy. And he was feared in Prague, Budapest, and East Berlin, no less than in Moscow. During Leonid Brezhnev's reign, Suslov's power reached its zenith. Unlike Khrushchev, Brezhnev was not an ideologue. He was a pragmatist, a bureaucrat who loved honors and a quiet life. Ideological subtleties tired him. This situation created an ideal symbiosis. Brezhnev provided overall leadership and stability, while Suslov took complete control of the ideological sphere, becoming in essence the second most powerful man in the state. A characteristic situation often arose at Politburo meetings. Some economic or international issue would be discussed, different opinions would be expressed, and at the end, Brezhnev would turn to Suslov, who had been silent until then, and ask, "Mikhail Andreevich, what is our position on this issue from the point of view of Marxism-Leninism?" Suslov's short, dry answer, his nod, or conversely, his disapproving shake of the head, put an end to the discussion. No one, not even the all-powerful Minister of Defense, Ustinov, or KGB Chief Andropov, dared to argue with Suslov on matters of ideology. It was his undivided domain. He was the main obstacle to any attempts at reform. When Prime Minister Alexei Kosygin attempted to implement economic reforms in the mid-1960s aimed at introducing elements of self-financing and material incentives, it was Suslov who led their quiet sabotage. He did not openly criticize them at congresses. He acted more subtly. The newspapers Pravda and Communist, which he controlled, published theoretical articles on the unacceptability of revising the foundations of socialist planning and the danger of petty bourgeois market tendencies. These articles, written in dry, academic language, were a signal to the entire party apparatus. Reforms were unwelcome. Kosygin's initiatives gradually got bogged down in bureaucratic quagmire, stifled by ideological attitudes. Suslov sincerely believed that any economic freedom would inevitably lead to political freedom, which, in his view, was tantamount to the demise of the system. The fear of him was a fear of the unpredictability of the consequences. His reaction to a particular idea was impossible to predict in terms of ordinary logic or benefit. He thought in terms of dogma. What seemed pragmatic and useful for the country could, in his eyes, look like ideological sabotage. He could nip a promising scientific project in the bud if he saw bourgeois influence in it, or ban a theater production in which he found hidden anti-Soviet undertones. His suspicion was total. He was convinced that enemies were everywhere, and their main goal was to undermine the ideological foundations of Soviet society. Even in the last years of his life, when he was already a very old man, he did not lose his influence. His frail figure in the presidium of congresses and plenums symbolized the immutability of the system, its ossification and inability to change. He became a living monument to the era he himself had created, the era of stagnation. His death in January 1982 was greeted with secret relief by many in the party leadership. The chief overseer, the censor, the one who had kept them in intellectual and career fear for decades, was gone. With his departure, the first, still imperceptible but already fatal crack appeared in the ideological monolith of Soviet power. The system lost its high priest, and it turned out that there was no one to replace him. The fear he instilled was one of the last pillars supporting the aging regime. And when that pillar collapsed, it was only a matter of time before the final collapse. Suslov's power had its own citadel, its own physical and bureaucratic center. The propaganda and agitation department of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, or Agitprop. It was a state within a state, an ideological counterintelligence agency whose tentacles penetrated all spheres of life. Any significant manuscript, be it a novel by a famous writer, a film script, a scientific monograph, or even a dissertation on the history of the party, began its tortuous journey through the authorities, but the final destination was always the desk in Suslov's office or that of his most trusted deputies. The process was deliberately humiliating and exhausting. A manuscript could be returned with a note saying, "Needs revision," without any specific instructions. The author would spend months knocking on doors, trying to guess what exactly the invisible censor did not like, making corrections that seemed absurd to him, and sending his brainchild back into the abyss of Agitprop. Sometimes Suslov's brief resolution, written in red pencil, appeared in the margins. It could be a single question: "Where is the partisanship here?" Or a laconic remark: "The author overlooks the leading role of the party." Such a note was tantamount to a sentence. It meant that the work would not only not be published, the author would be branded as ideologically immature or even an alien element. This mechanism worked flawlessly, creating an atmosphere of total self-censorship. People began to fear not so much the direct ban as the agonizing, soul-destroying bureaucratic red tape, at the end of which inevitable defeat awaited them. Many talented authors broke down, began to write for their desk, or, even worse, tried to conform, crippling their own ideas to please the invisible guardians of dogma. One of the most destructive manifestations of his power was his patronage of Lysenkoism. Trofim Lysenko, a self-taught agronomist who rejected classical genetics as bourgeois pseudoscience, found his most powerful defender in Suslov. For Suslov, it was not a matter of scientific arguments. He did not understand them. For him, genetics, with its Mendelian laws and chromosomal theory, was a foreign Western doctrine that called into question the Marxist thesis about the possibility of changing human nature and society through willpower. Lysenko's Miturin biology, which promised instant results and the transformation of species at the behest of the party, fit perfectly into his worldview. At the famous session of the All-Union Academy of Agricultural Sciences in August 1948, which destroyed Soviet genetics, Suslov was one of the behind-the-scenes conductors. He secured Lysenko's full party support, and after that, for decades, an entire scientific field was left to charlatans. World-renowned scientists such as Nikolai Vavilov were repressed, their schools destroyed, and the country, which had one of the most powerful genetic potentials in the world, was left behind in scientific progress. Even after Stalin's death, when timid attempts to rehabilitate genetics began, Suslov stood his ground, blocking publications and defending Lysenko. For him, it was not a question of science, but of ideological principle. To acknowledge that the geneticists were right would mean admitting that party dogma could be wrong, and he could not allow that. No less indicative was his long-standing war with the magazine Novy Mir and its editor-in-chief, the poet Alexander Tvardovsky. During the thaw years, Novy Mir became a breath of fresh air, a center of attraction for all honest intellectuals. It was there that Solzhenitsyn's story, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, was published. Suslov hated the magazine with a fierce hatred, seeing it as a hotbed of liberalism and revisionism. But he did not act harshly. He did not close the magazine with a stroke of his pen. Instead, he began a methodical siege. Each issue was subjected to the harshest censorship. Publications were delayed for months. Tvardovsky was subjected to enormous pressure through party organs. The Central Committee constantly received letters from workers, organized by the apparatus, condemning the magazine's anti-Soviet position. Suslov personally summoned Tvardovsky to talks where, for hours, in his dry, monotonous voice, he reprimanded him for ideological errors. It was a war of attrition that lasted for years and ultimately broke even a man as steadfast as Tvardovsky. In 1970, he was forced to resign as editor-in-chief, and Novy Mir was destroyed. Suslov won, demonstrating that the system was capable of slowly and inexorably stifling any hotbed of free thought. Suslov's relationship with other centers of power, such as the KGB, was unique. He did not command the Chekists, but he gave them what their activities needed to make sense: ideological justification. The KGB could arrest a person and fabricate a case, but it was Suslov's apparatus that clothed it in the necessary wording, turning the victim into an agent of world imperialism, a bourgeois nationalist, or a Zionist. He was the supreme theorist of repression. When Yuri Andropov became chairman of the KGB and launched a campaign against dissidents, he worked in close collaboration with Suslov. It was Suslov who determined who was to be considered particularly dangerous, whose ideas posed a threat to the system. He oversaw the creation of special psychiatric hospitals for dissidents because, in his view, anyone who opposed the most perfect system in the world could not be normal. They could only be insane or an enemy. Thus, even the all-powerful KGB was to some extent dependent on the ideological verdicts of the Grey Cardinal. He ensured the ideological security of the state, and in this matter, his authority was absolute. Personal meetings with him left a lasting impression on people. He hardly ever smiled. His long, ascetic face was an impenetrable mask. He spoke quietly, almost without intonation, but every word was carefully weighed and hit the mark. He had the ability to look at his interlocutor as if he could see right through them, with all their secret thoughts and fears. Many, leaving his office, admitted that they felt completely drained, as if all their willpower had been sucked out of them. He did not raise his voice, but his icy calm was more frightening than the shouting of any other boss. This psychological effect was part of his power. People feared not only his actions, but also his personality, his aura of a ruthless and incorruptible fanatic. He was the chief guardian of the unwritten rules and rituals of Soviet political life. It was he who ensured the correct citation of the classics of Marxism-Leninism, the order of the Politburo members on the podium of the mausoleum, and the wording of obituaries. He perceived any deviation from the canon as a symptom of decay. In this sense, he was not just a conservative, he was a reactionary who tried to stop time and freeze the system forever in the form it had taken under Stalin, but without mass terror. He was the chief architect of the era of stagnation, creating a stifling atmosphere in which any lively movement, any fresh thought, was suffocated before it could even be born. And the fear he instilled was not fear of man, but fear of the very system he personified. Impersonal, relentless, and utterly indifferent to the fate of the individual. The origins of this icy orthodoxy can be found in his early career, forged in the fire of the 1930s. Working in the Stavropol region during the Great Terror, he was not at the forefront of the repressions, but was engaged in ideological work and personnel matters, which meant participating in purges, compiling character assessments, and passing verdicts that destroyed lives. But it was in Lithuania that his methods were truly honed. Sent there in 1944 to Sovietize the newly liberated republic, he headed the Central Committee's Bureau for Lithuania. This was not just administrative work. It was a total ideological purge. He oversaw the suppression of the Forest Brothers, collectivization, the eradication of the influence of the Catholic Church, and the imposition of Soviet culture. He acted ruthlessly, methodically, and with absolute emotionlessness, like a machine. It was there that he demonstrated to Stalin his main trait: absolute loyalty not to a person, but to the system, and a complete lack of personal ambition, which made him an ideal executor who posed no threat. His unique position became apparent immediately after Stalin's death. During the brief period of collective leadership when yesterday's comrades fought for power, Suslov briefly became editor of the newspaper Pravda. This was symbolic. He became the one who formulated the posthumous truth about the leader. Later, when Khrushchev began his campaign to debunk the cult of personality, it was Suslov who performed miracles of ideological balancing. He became the chief theorist of de-Stalinization, but a special kind of de-Stalinization. He helped to separate Stalin's personality, his mistakes and excesses, from the system he had created, which had to be preserved intact. This required casuistic skill, to condemn terror but justify the dictatorship of the proletariat, to criticize the cult but preserve centralized party power. He became the architect of a paradox that defined the entire subsequent history of the Soviet Union. Attempts to purge Stalinism without abandoning its foundations. This cemented his reputation as the indispensable guardian of the system's ideological integrity, capable of explaining and justifying any zigzag in the party line. His influence on foreign policy was no less significant, though less noticeable. Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko, known as Mr. No, was often forced to check his diplomatic moves against Suslov's ideological positions. Any compromise with the West, any agreement on disarmament, was viewed by Suslov through the prism of class struggle. He could block an almost agreed treaty if he saw in one of its formulations an ideological concession to imperialism. Diplomats in the foreign ministry knew that getting the Politburo's approval was only half the battle. They still had to pass through Suslov's invisible filter, who could consider a pragmatic step a manifestation of opportunism. He created a rigid ideological corset for Soviet diplomacy, which often prevented it from acting flexibly and effectively on the international stage, but guaranteed the purity of Marxist-Leninist principles. Even in matters of succession to the throne, his shadow loomed over the Kremlin. In the late 1970s, when Brezhnev's health began to deteriorate rapidly, possible successors were discussed behind the scenes. Suslov's name was never mentioned as a candidate. Everyone understood that he did not aspire to supreme power. But everyone also understood that without his tacit blessing, no candidate would be accepted. He was the cardinal who was supposed to place the tiara on the head of the new pope. His assessment of a candidate's ideological steadfastness and party impeccability was decisive. That is why all potential contenders, from Kirilenko to Chernenko and Andropov, feared him, and at the same time curried favor with him. They knew that this dry, dispassionate old man held the key not only to the past, but also to the future of the party. His death in 1982, just 10 months before Brezhnev's death, created a vacuum not only of power, but also of legitimacy. The chief arbiter was gone, and the system, deprived of its ideological backbone, began to slowly fall apart. The fear he instilled was the last hoop holding together the crumbling barrel of the Soviet regime. His power was fueled by another unique resource. He was the living institutional memory of the party. Having lived through several eras, he remembered the background to decisions made under Stalin and could nip any new initiative, even the most sensible, in the bud, with the killer phrase, "We already discussed this in 1953. Comrade Stalin pointed out the fallacy of this approach at the time. Against such an argument, appealing to the sacred past, the younger members of the Politburo did not stand a chance. His pedantry reached the point of absurdity. He could interrupt a discussion of the 5-year plan to correct the speaker, insisting that one should say not developed socialism, but developed socialist society, as this was more accurate from a theoretical point of view. This scholasticism was not an old man's whim, but an instrument of power, demonstrating who was the sole and infallible interpreter of sacred texts. The pinnacle of his activity was the creation of the Brezhnev Constitution of 1977. As chairman of the Constitutional Commission, he turned its meetings into his own one-man show, personally writing and defending the famous Article 6 on the leading and guiding role of the CPSU. He legally cemented the order that he had protected all his life, turning the party dictatorship into the country's basic law. He was the editor-in-chief not only of newspapers, but also of history itself, personally supervising multi-volume works on the history of the CPSU and the Great Patriotic War. The names of undesirable figures and entire tragic events were erased from them, creating a sterile, ideologically verified myth in which the party was always wise and infallible. Even the powerful army was not free from his influence. Through the main political administration of the Soviet Army and Navy, Glavpur, he controlled the entire system of ideological indoctrination. The appointment of any major political officer, from division commander and above, was tacitly agreed with his apparatus. He ensured that the armed forces remained not only defenders of the motherland, but first and foremost, a loyal and ideologically savvy tool of the party. His control was total, penetrating barracks, scientific laboratories, and meeting rooms, turning the whole country into a single ideological space where he was the supreme, invisible, and therefore even more fearsome arbiter. Mikhail Suslov remained a figure whose silent presence determined the fate of many in the Politburo. His ideological intransigence, ability to influence personnel, and participation in key events made him an object